So now I've got that base layer down, I can start working out what I want to do as far as the detail elements. What I'm going to be using for that is this packing material stuff, kind of a medium density foam that seems to be turning up in a lot of packaging as an alternative to polystyrene. But before I do that, I need to lay down a little bit of a repair where this sort of Frankenstein sort of stitching is at the moment, where I had to pack out that extra shoulder and get into the joints. Again, I'm just using another piece of stocking material that I'll use to create that skin, and once again using the silicone, I'll just glue it down in place. At the moment I'm just holding it all in place whilst it all glues up. I'm just using some plumber's tape so that it doesn't leave any sticky residue behind. And then the hope is to sort of do a bit of a transfer of what looks like the scales onto this foam area. And then using the soldering iron, I will go and cut those line details into it to get the effect that we're going for. And then when the final layer of silicone is applied, it'll flesh out those scales and make them look the way I want it to. Will it work? I don't know. It's like I said, this is all pretty experimental, so you'll find out when I find out. In between waiting for glues and silicones to dry, I've also been working on the Japanese hot tub project, so that'll be another one that you'll have to keep an eye out for. So, long story short, that didn't work. Once the silicone's dried, it peels off really easily. I thought it would stick a lot better than it is. It has, however, left a really interesting texture in the silicone. So whilst that's still a bit of a failure, it's still something to file away in the memory banks for future projects. So the next question is, if that's not going to work, what do I need to do to make it work? And I think what I'm going to do is fall back to a previous technique of making up some silicone putty and seeing if that gives me the result that I'm after. To make up the putty, what I'm using is a mixture of corn flour, cornstarch, whatever you prefer, and simply mixing it with the same silicone I used as the undercoat. I've used this technique before for making up press molds, and it seemed to work quite well for that, so we'll see how this goes. There's no particular rule as far as this is concerned. I find that once it gets to a point where it's a little bit flaky, it's getting close to being the right consistency, but really what I'm trying to do is build up the volume of it so that it's more like a really soft clay rather than just the raw silicone. Once it gets to the point where it's the firmness that I'm after, I just sort of fold it in on itself, and that's when it starts to build up the stickiness again, and then it's ready to be applied. This time, to smooth it out, instead of using the dishwashing detergent, I'm using some mineral turpentine and just sort of getting it applied with a brush really lightly and then just smoothing it out by hand. This will do two things. It'll slow down the setting time, and it gives me a surface which is a little bit more creamy to work on, so I can sort of spread it around and start getting a much finer surface. This is still a bit of an experimental layer, but that looks a lot better. That's sort of allowing me to get that ridge in his neck. So I'm going to have to persevere with it a little bit and get my mix right as far as the putty that I'm making up, but I think that's actually going to produce a better result than what I had in mind anyway. So whilst this is still wet, I thought I'd show you roughly how it should work. The easiest way to put it to you is that very little detail in there at the moment. I still only put a pretty thin layer on there, but if you compare that to what I'm trying to go for into the look of the neck, you can see that the head doesn't really look right at all by comparison. And if you're looking at this sort of domeness to the back of his head, by comparison there's nowhere near as much that's there. But what I've done and what I'm trying to do with this is, as I'm sculpting it, I'm sort of sculpting it into position so that the skin that I'm creating itself gives me the effect that I'm looking for. And I don't want to mess with this too much because, as I said, it's still wet. But if I lift his head back to the proper position, you can see how that sort of skin starts to gather up, and it starts to build up those neck vertebrae, and you can sort of see here how that roundness of the head starts to push back more into the shape that we're after. So I want it to dry in that position at the moment so that it's got that stretch in the silicone. So it's really just going to be a matter of building up consecutive layers, some thick and some thin, until I'm happy with the general look of it. Okay, so that's 100% dry now, and I'm really happy with the look of that. The lighting's not real great in here, so you probably can't see the contouring that I've got in there at the moment. But now that I'm happy with the way that that's working, that's definitely the technique that I'll be using to get that sort of underlying muscular shape into it and sort of the vertebrae lines of his neck. And the only real difference to the plan now is where I was going to use the foam stuff to sort of do 2-in-1 with the fleshing out of those muscular bits and the scaling elements all in one. What I'll do now is to use this putty idea to pack the areas of the body out where I feel like it needs to, and then I'll add the scaling details over that to get the finishing detail that we're looking for. So it's clearly going to be a bit by bit process, but I'm really happy with the way that that's sculpting in. And if the neck bit that I did earlier is anything to go by, that muscular shape tends to build up really nicely. And I'm still trying to mimic some of the other details that are in him. Kind of like the bulb on his butt there. The biggest thing I need to remember and work with is to not flesh it out too much, because I've still got to make room for the scales that have got to go over the top of it. I mean, if necessary, I could cut it back, but that's just wasting materials. So I'm trying to visualize the underlying muscles and tendons that it's going to need, so that when that scale layer goes over the top of it, it'll match the final look of it properly. So as I said, I've been working on other stuff in the background, and I've got a nice pile of sawdust there. And given that my bench is nice and wet down with the terps, I'm thinking I might do a bit of an experiment with some of the sawdust and silicone and make up a sawdust version of the putty and see how it sets up whilst I'm waiting for this other stuff to set. I'm not going to make up a lot of this. This is purely just an experiment to see what happens. This is quite literally just the sawdust that I've swept up off my floor, so it's all full of little twiggy bits and it's not particularly fine. I could probably sift it out and get finer bits and not have to worry about those little pieces, but like I said, it's more as a let's see what happens type piece. First thing I've noticed is it feels like it's not going to take up as much of the sawdust as it has the corn flour, but that's kind of interesting. Okay, so I'm going to call that enough and just mix that. This is a much stiffer clay. Alright, so depending on how that sets, that might be interesting for things like the bottom of his feet, where I need something a bit stiffer. It doesn't smooth out as much as the other stuff, but that's to be expected because it's a much grainier base than I'm using when it comes to the sawdust. The other thing too is if I sifted this out, I'd end up with a much finer powder, and that might make for a more interesting sort of mix as well. So I'll do two bits. I'll do up a little ball, so it's got some volume, and I'll do up a flat piece. It's a bit more inclined to crack around the edges, but I can push that back together. So it'll be interesting to see what this is like once it sets. So I'm going to go about 4 or 5 mil thick. I'll leave those bits aside to set and see what we end up with. Okay. So that's a lot stronger than I thought it was going to be. I half expected it to be really flaky, but it's really strong. Alright, I'm definitely going to be investigating this one further. That's way too good of a material to not be using for something. Given the way it mixed up as well, it produced a much thicker sort of clay. So it's going to give me two different types that I can use. One that's a fair bit stiffer, and then the stuff that's mixed in with the corn flour is a lot more flexible by comparison. So no chance. But given how well that's come together as a composite material, that's going to be really useful. Alright, so it looks like I need to sift out some sawdust and keep it aside, because that's really good. So the stuff I'm using to make these press molds is called a chromatic alginate. It's more commonly used in the dental industry to do impressions of people's teeth so that they can have dentures made up and that sort of thing. It has a very quick mix and setting time. You've got to mix it up really quickly and get it on. It only sets within a couple of minutes. It starts out a purpley sort of colour, then goes to a pink, and then when it sets up it's a white colour, and then it'll actually go back to a very light pink again when it's fully cured. It's also commonly used in life casting, if you want to cast a person's face or hand or something like that. You may have even seen them used for baby memories type things where they cast a baby's hand in it. So it's a very rapid way of pulling an impression of something with a pretty high degree of accuracy. But unlike silicone, it has a very short shelf life. So the biggest areas I'm trying to pick up are these horn-covered collarbone type pieces. Once it's set, it's really only strong enough that you could probably pull 2 or 3 molds out of it of what it is you're trying to replicate before it would completely deteriorate. And unlike silicone molding, it's really a much more disposable type of molding process, because after a day or two it'll dry out to the point where the mold shrinks and actually becomes quite brittle. So as I said in previous videos, I'm not looking at doing a mould of his entire body, rather I'm just sort of picking out some of the more high detailed areas that give me points of reference when I come to filling in and completing the sculpt. This will give me a really basic mould that I can glue down to that skin surface, and then I hope to be able to blend in the less detailed areas by hand. It doesn't produce a particularly good mould, but for the sake of how I'm doing this, I don't really need it to. I just need to have those points of reference so that I can finish the sculpt in between them. I've also managed to pull a mould piece off his face, just to pick up some of those details around his eyes and stuff. You can already see how delicate that is in terms of sort of falling apart already, but that's given me enough reference that once I pull the silicone out of that, I've been able to apply it to the skull and start putting it into position. There's still going to be an awful lot of corrections that need to be doing, and I've got to fix out his eyelids and that sort of stuff, and you can still see that there's some gaps and stuff here that I'm just waiting to dry now. And that's the sort of piece I'm talking about, where I'll blend that sculpt down to the other area where it connects down onto his back. So I've got to set that aside for drying now, but I think that gives you a pretty good idea of the principle that I'm trying to use. I've been set back a little bit time-wise in terms of getting it finished, given that the foam didn't work out quite the way I wanted it to. And I probably could have left that bit out of this video altogether, but with an experimental project like this, I do like to show the failures as well as the successes, so that you guys get to see my full process. And who knows, hopefully one of my failures will help somebody out there from making the same mistakes as well. So that'll be the update for this time, guys. Thanks for watching. Talk to you next time.